A lot of people asked about this one. Why do we call chunks of games levels? And what about all the other fun words we've used at various times, like stage, world, zone, and so on? I was planning to do a video that quickly ran through a whole bunch of requests that I didn't think needed a big explanation, but the development of the word level ended up being more complicated than I expected. As a gaming term, we define level as each of a series of stages of increasing difficulty through which a player may progress, completing one stage in order to reach the next. In more general terms, level can mean a lot of things. It can be floors in a building, the amount or number of something, a measure of rank or ability, and like 10 other things that aren't really relevant to us right now. So how did it get into games? Looking at a lot of early games, many of them didn't really have levels as we think of them today. If you watched my video on the origin of the term boss, you'll recall how many classic arcade games just went on forever. There wasn't really any forward progress, and the player just survived as long as possible, trying to get a high score. In the absence of levels, games tended to describe separate chunks of gameplay as rounds, waves, or occasionally stages. As games got a little more complex, they started to have the action divided between different locations. Something that today we would probably think of as different levels. But the idea didn't catch on right away. Scrolling levels were still a ways off, so these games would often have a level taking up exactly one screen. These single screen levels were often called boards, or screens. It was common for these games to boast about the number of screens they had in their advertisements. Limited memory meant there often weren't very many screens, usually only 3 or 4, so they were set to loop endlessly until the player was defeated. Beat all 4 screens, and you just started on the first one again. Sometimes there was some sort of progression in difficulty, sometimes it was exactly the same, so the focus was still less on getting through all the levels, and still more about just getting a high score. Home consoles of the 70s were much the same. For example, most Atari games also tended to refer to the levels as screens or rounds, depending on the game.
Atari introduces the Woman of the Year, Ms. Pac-Man. Just like the arcade classic, 4 different game screens, floating fruit, even pretzels.
Honey, don't you know I'm more than Pac-Man with a bow?
Reach for Ms. Pac-Man.
Reach for Atari.
But we do start seeing references to levels popping up a little bit more.
Got him. Vicious beggar. Oh, you've reached level 4. Oh, you've got it. It's a game even a mummy can love. Gum from Parker Brothers.
As we went into the 80s and technology improved, we started to see a few changes. Games began adding some sort of counter to help players keep track of their progress. For example, Pac-Man levels all take place on the same maze, but each level would change out the bonus item Pac-Man could collect and keep track of it in the corner. Space Invader Part 2 put little counters on the player's shields. Donkey Kong had 2 counters. The game had 4 screens, and each screen would raise a height counter by 25 meters. When the player cleared all 4 of the screens, the level counter would go up by 1, and the screens would repeat. When we hit the 8-bit era, it became standard for games to have actual levels as we usually think of them today. Most Nintendo and Sega games had a set number of levels for the player to get through, with an ending once they were all completed. At this point, the word level is pretty common, but we still see some variants. Words like stage, world, and zone are still seeing a fair amount of use. Around this time, we also start to see the world-level format that would become very common. Most people point to Super Mario Bros. As the first one to do this. I didn't find an earlier example of this, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was one out there. Games like Sonic and Mario 3 began to group up levels with a similar theme or appearance into stages or worlds. Now we'd have a number of icy levels in an ice world, or factory levels in a factory world. So why out of all these words did level become the standard? Well, to answer that, we're going to jump back to the beginning, because while arcades were doing their thing, in another corner of the gaming world, the word level caught on much quicker. Let's bounce back to 1974 with the printing of the very first Dungeons & Dragons book. Yes, once again we're about to see how Dungeons & Dragons had a big impact on how we think about games decades later. Early on, while describing how to prepare for a game, the book describes all the things a dungeon master, here referred to as a referee, should have on hand. First, the referee must draw out a minimum of half a dozen maps of the levels of his underworld, people them with monsters of various horrid aspect, distribute treasures accordingly, and note the location of the latter two on keys, each corresponding to the appropriate level. So right away, D&D was referring to the maps an adventuring party would navigate as levels. D&D is using level to refer to a few different things here: the floors of a dungeon the players are exploring, the power of the player's character, and the difficulty of the monsters. As we can see in some of these other pages, a DM was supposed to be able to quickly set up an appropriate monster encounter by simply matching up the level of the monster with the level of the dungeon. Level 1 monsters would be on the first level of the dungeon, level 5 monsters would be on the 5th. These would also determine the amount of experience and treasure the player should expect as their reward. You might recall from some other videos that a lot of very early computer games were heavily influenced by Dungeons & Dragons. There is a tendency to borrow a lot of the themes and general rules to make dungeon crawling style games. But these games also borrowed a lot of terminology of Dungeons & Dragons. Things like hit points, spell slots, and yes, levels were very common.
What are you doing? Levels. Levels. I'm gonna build these different levels.
Remember the game of Dungeons, aka D&D? This was the game that had the very first boss battle. In 1975, it was one of the first video RPGs. It used level to signify both the strength of the player character and which floor of the dungeon you were on. This trend would continue for many other video RPGs throughout the 70s and into the 80s with games like Rogue. I think what we're really seeing here is two different sets of technologies leading to different types of games. Arcade games had to be fast and flashy. They usually ran off of custom boards that allowed better graphics. They were designed to attract players, run them through their games quickly to get them spending more quarters, and there just wasn't time for careful exploration or screens full of character stats. Conversely, early computer games were mostly being developed and played on university mainframe computers accessed via terminal. These were systems designed for education first. In fact, many early games for these systems are lost because administrators just kept deleting them. Petit 5, one of the earliest dungeon crawlers, survived mostly by having a generic name that blended in with other files. These systems could be slow to run, they often had monochrome monitors that only displayed one color, but players could get significantly more time to play them in one sitting. So these players tended to gravitate towards slower-paced, text-heavy games. This is also where we start seeing text adventures such as Colossal Cave Adventure and Zork. Some of these games weren't as big on the use of level, but as home computers became more common, they led to the rise of games like Rogue, Hack, Moria. These games continued the trend of worlds divided into different floors, which were often called levels. Even when they weren't explicitly named as levels, I think it helps solidify the idea of different areas of the game as being on different vertical levels from one another. I wondered if this might end up being another case of Japanese influencing gamer lingo in English, but in this case, I don't think so. Level was sometimes used for character level, especially toward the mid-80s in games such as Dragon Quest, but in earlier games it was much more common to see words like stage or area instead of level. Men, meaning face or surface, was often used the way English games use screen or board. In RPGs where level was quite common in English, Japanese games tended to use floor, either using the Japanese counter kai or as an English loanword, floor. It doesn't look like level became popular in Japan until the mid-80s, and even then it doesn't look like it ever really got as common as it did in North America. Just like in my video on the use of the word boss in gaming, I tried getting a look at what language was popular in different gaming magazines. Since this was before online discussion was common, published works are one of the only surviving records of what language different parts of the gaming industry were using. Issue 1 of Nintendo Power, published in 1988, uses a wide variety of words. In an article about Contra, they use zone, which lines up with its game manual. For Double Dragon, they use mission, despite the manual using stage. In other early issues, it's a widespread, but I think the word stage seems to be coming up more often. This holds pretty true even much later. Looking at this issue from 1993, 5 years later, in Guides to Star Fox and the Aliens 3 and Goof Troop games, they use stage. For Speedy Gonzales, they use zone. Then they used level when describing these Wile E. Coyote and Jurassic Park games. This EGM issue from the same year is similar. Level gets a lot of use, but they also use scene, section, and round within a few pages of each other. I suspected that magazines which reported on home computer gaming would have a higher rate of using level, so I took a look at issues of Zap 64 magazine, a gaming magazine which focused on Commodore 64 games. Even from its first issue, it showed a strong preference for using level over synonyms like stage, zone, or world. Crash magazine, which looked at gaming on the ZX Spectrum, showed a similar preference. I should also note that these are UK publications, so there's a chance that the difference might be between Europe and North America, and not between consoles and computers, as I suspect. Maybe there's going to be some European gamers in the comments who can help us figure out if this is a regional divide or a technological one. In 1980, only about 1% of American households owned a computer. By 1990, it had gone up to around 20%. It feels to me like level became more common in console gaming as more people were exposed to computer gaming, which was already showing a preference for the word. Again, I went back to check out game guidebooks. Much like the use of the word boss, it seems like many of these books also decided to use the word level pretty much exclusively. At this point, most gaming magazines were only writing about games on a particular system, but some of these companies wrote guides for games on pretty much every system, as well as specialized guides for particular games. I might be assigning too much significance to these books, but it does feel to me like they're a good source of standardizing terms across a wide variety of game genres and game systems. So what does it all mean? It's all a bit mixed up and fuzzy, but here's my best breakdown of what happened. Level was used extensively in Dungeons & Dragons right from the beginning. It was a convenient choice since multiple definitions let them use the same word to indicate the depth of a floor, the rank of power for a character, or a monster. D&D inspired a lot of computer programmers who made games using similar terminology, including the word level. But at first, these multi-level games were being played on specialized computers that were only available to a very small population. At the same time, arcade games were becoming popular, but didn't usually have multiple levels and thus described their advances in terms of round or waves. Early home console games tended to have single-screen levels and still tended to use words like screen or board. But home computer systems had more games inspired by those early dungeon crawlers and adapted the use of the word level to a greater degree. In the mid-80s, we started the 8-bit era, where it was much more common to have games with many separate levels and a defined ending. The word level picks up a lot here, but it's still very common to see words like stage and world. Toward the late 80s and into the early 90s, it seems like there's a bit of a shift. The 16-bit era added more complexity to games, and it became more common to have a level being one playable chunk of a game, and stage or world being several levels with a similar theme. I think this is what really solidified the use of level over other words, but stage and world never really went away, even if they became less common. This seems to have held steady throughout the rest of the 90s and into the 2000s. Today, the video game level is in something of a decline.
So, how are your levels coming along? Well, I decided I'm not going to do it.
Early games were so small they didn't have separate levels, and now we've sort of gone full circle with open world games that have a map so big that also doesn't really get divided into levels. Games that are divided into levels often try to hide it. It's common to describe levels as missions. RPGs often have temples or dungeons. Multiplayer games like to use the word map instead of level. Gamers still use the word more generally. Oh man, not another water level. But the games with numbered levels are definitely a shrinking minority. And I think that brings us to the end of this one. Thanks again to all the people who wrote in with this suggestion, and to all of you for watching. If you've got a question or idea you'd like to see me cover, or you think I missed something in this video, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.